Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Big Brother ranking here. Now earlier in the year I did end up doing a Survivor first boot ranking, and here we'll be doing the same thing but for Big Brother. So here I'll be ranking every player booted at the first eviction ceremony for every season. Now this will be a ranking based on how I feel like they played on their individual seasons, not how they are as players in the grand scheme of things, which ends up radically changing the list here. Also, with Big Brother, there are a lot of weird circumstances with this list, so I do want to give a quick rundown of who exactly will be on this list. I mean, first up, there will be no Big Brother 1, as it's Big Brother 1. Also, this list will comprise of the players that were evicted at the first formal eviction ceremony of every season. I will not be including expulsions or quits in this, no day one evictions or anything similar to that. Also, this will only include players from the main series of the show, so no celebrity or OTT. And again, there are still some weird cases along the way, like BB9, where Jacob technically wasn't like a day one eviction, but he was evicted in an abnormal way, so I won't be including him, but I will be including Jen and Parker. So again, two people from BB9, as again, that was Till Death Do You Part. And also for BB24, we have the weird circumstance of the first eviction being canceled. So I will not be including Paloma on this list, and instead we'll be including Pooch, who was the first person formally evicted from the house. So with that, we do have 24 players that we will be ranking here. Let's start off at number 24. The worst first boot in my eyes, based on how they played on their individual season, does come from BB9, and that person is Jen. And I mean, I've already talked about Jen before on my worst players of all time list, and I do think Jen plays a pretty historically bad game here. Now, I do think there are some factors from outside the game that obviously affect this, largely in the fact that she was there with her boyfriend in Ryan, which really should have been a massive advantage had they been able to keep it secret. But instead, Jen, getting paranoid that this secret will spread, decides to just tell the entire house, and through that makes herself a massive target along with Ryan. But even beyond that, she got extremely power hungry in the game, to the point where everyone just hated her. I mean, she was a massive social pariah in the game, to the point where they did not want to reward Ryan with the win, because they knew that if they did, that means some of the money would be going to Jen. And obviously all of her poor gameplay ends up sinking the game of another person who we will be talking about much later in this list. So really, I feel like Jen is a player here that was poised for success. She had Ryan in there as a secret weapon, but instead just blows that opportunity, along with getting massive HOH-itis during her power couple stint, to where Jen just comes off as such a terrible player here. So because I do have her at the bottom of the list here, number 24. Number 23, we have a player that I do find very interesting. I do think this is a player that is probably better than what his placement signifies here, particularly strategically, but at the same time made so many missteps I just cannot rectify putting them higher. In at 23, we do have Mike Lubinski from Big Brother 5. And Mike is a player that was probably ahead of his time. He did seem to be a competent strategic thinker, in the sense that he is essentially the creator of the backdoor, mind you, not in its full form, but was the first person in the Big Brother 5 house to bring it up as a concept. Also beyond that, he recognized that the four horsemen were coming together and wanted to target the likes of Jace and Scott. The problem is that he did that while Jace was HOH, and through him trying to build a counter alliance, almost immediately it causes him to be the target for the week, which is obviously terrible gameplay there. But also at the same time, I feel like Mike Lubinski is just the type of person that's going to be targeted early anyway. I mean, he is obviously on the older side of things on any typical Big Brother cast. He doesn't really fit in any season of Big Brother. So I do think the fact that he does go all out here and plays really hard is something to be commended. The problem is that he obviously does it poorly, and does it to the point where he becomes the target for that first week. But I do think there are things to applaud Mike Lubinski for. But again, in this first boot ranking, it's like a lot of his aggressive gameplay is what causes him to be the boot, to where he was just such an easy consensus target from the beginning and really had no way out of it by the time he lost the veto. And really, Mike is someone that I want to put higher on the list, but I don't feel like I can. He's here at number 23. Now number 22, and we're on a string of a few first boots here that I really don't have a great grasp on their games, as they really just didn't do that much. However, each of them do have an aspect of them being kind of screwed over to a degree, but this one less so. So at 22, we do have Ashlea, the first boot from Big Brother 6, who, again, just really doesn't do much. It just feels like she didn't bond with really anyone in the house. She was an outlier, which is considered an easy target for the first week. And this is all despite having Janelle as a secret partner for her coming into the season. And also when she's on the block against Keesha, this guy that comes off immediately as this pretty big threat, to where even James is calling him out as being a big threat right away. Despite that, Ashlea is still the one they voted out here, which, to be fair, part of that you can credit Keesha for building a strong relationship with the likes of Eric that allowed him to stay that week, but still, Ashlea really just felt like she didn't really do much and was just kind of on the bottom right away, really didn't bond with really anybody there, and didn't have as many outside factors as the next few people that we'll be talking about. So because of that, for me, Ashlea is stuck here at number 22. At number 21, we have a very similar first boot in almost every way. Really, one minor difference made me put this person above Ashlea. At 21, we do have Carol from Big Brother 8. And again, Carol, same thing. Was an outcast right away, put on the block, easy consensus boot, didn't seem to have many bonds in the house, even seemed to kind of give up by the end. Not much to really praise for Carol for me, but I feel like the one thing that edges her above Ashlea on this list is the fact that she did have her rival come into the house day one in Jessica, who through her coming in was able to spread a lot of negative information about her, while also Jessica herself being safe for the week. And I feel like that is an aspect of bad luck for Carol here. Now, at the end of the day, do I think it mattered that much? Probably not. She just seemed like an easy consensus boot anyway, but it is something to mention here to differentiate Carol and Ashlea. So for me, Carol is here at number 21. Now, number 20, very similar thing again. Another first boot, didn't seem to do much in the game. I think this person was definitely screwed over more so than the last couple people, and that person is Amanda from Big Brother 4. And I will say, Amanda is someone that I did consider putting higher, because again, I do think Amanda was legitimately screwed in certain aspects, and maybe in more ways than one. But Amanda obviously has a similar situation to Carol, where her ex was in the game from the very beginning in Scott, who ends up being a very volatile presence in the season, to the point where Scott and Amanda's bickering did cause Amanda to be looked at as a negative presence in the house. That definitely harmed her game there. Also adding in the fact that she was an ex, and with the original players obviously having the majority, the exes became the very easy targets right away, and through that also put a target on her back. So again, these are very unlucky circumstances for Amanda that I do think makes her clearly on top of this tier. And again, I debated putting her higher because of these things. The reason I didn't, though, is because, like, really, she just didn't do much. Like, I have nothing to really say about Amanda in terms of her actual game ability. It didn't seem like she really tried to stay, and also the fact that she was against G, who again should have been a much more threatening player in the game, especially considering G had relationships with the likes of Justin and Robert. The fact that they keep G in the game there over Amanda, I think, is a bigger indictment on Amanda as well. So while I do think she was massively screwed over, I just really don't have anything positive to say about her either. So she's here at number 20. Now, number 19, moving on to a pretty big tier of players here. This is a tier of guys that all pretty much initially came off as threatening. They all came into the house, already had a target on their back due to the fact that they were looked at as big physical threats, but still along the way had some actively poor play. And we're starting it off at number 18 with the most recent boot on the list here. We are starting off with Pooch from Big Brother 24. And Pooch is a player that, again, like, had actually some positives in his game, largely in the fact that while it is very icky, his treatment of Taylor, he was effective in getting Taylor backdoored in week 1. And really, I did consider that as a reason to potentially put him higher on the list. The fact that he did technically get his way week 1 before the Paloma quit that stopped the actual eviction, and to be fair, the backstage boss twist would have stopped everything anyway. But also you have to consider the fact that he was safe during week 1, where he did end up getting the backstage pass, and through that was safe that entire week. And even despite that, despite having this power in the game, he was still left out of the majority alliance. He was initially brought in probably because of the fact that he had this pass, but was eventually kicked out. And I do think that is definitely an indictment on his game, and for him to eventually become the target for week 2, and at that point obviously has the notorious move of volunteering to go on the block, only to proceed to be blindsided by the end of the week. Again, again, that's obviously really terrible as well. Now, again, Pooch had some allies. He had some people that were fighting for him. I mean, the likes of Turner and Joseph didn't want him to go. He had the likes of Monty and Kyle who were campaigning for him at a point. But again, he really just did it to himself. He put himself on the block. While he would have potentially been a backdoor target that week anyway, he just offered himself up to be on the block, while also getting himself kicked out of the majority alliance through his open scheming with people that weren't in that initial majority alliance. And really, Pooch ended up playing a pretty poor game here. Number 19. Now number 18, moving on to, again, a pretty similar first boot for me, and that is Jace from Big Brother 17. And Jace is someone that I did debate being lower than Pooch. I mean, again, like Pooch at least did get Taylor backdoored, so at least there's that. Jace never really got much effectively done. However, Jace also didn't nominate himself, so again, at least there's that. And really outside of that, Jace is in a pretty similar position to Pooch, though I think was even more so a target coming into it, was already looked at as a big threat from the majority alliance, and was already the backdoor plan from very early on in that week. And once he gets backdoor, he does do a lot of campaigning. I mean, something I will give him credit for is how much he worked in his last few days to try to stay, and ultimately fails, but I will also say his campaigning was really terrible, where he would push people away. I mean, the way he treats Steve is ridiculous, and again, while he tries, his campaigning was never really effective. But again, he had some allies by the end of it. I mean, obviously he had Austin, Liz and Julia, even though only being one player at the time, did want to keep him around. But he didn't really have much of a chance of staying there, and was never really solidly positioned throughout the entire week. So because of it, for me, he's here at number 18. Now number 17, similar first boot, but had a couple more allies. And really, I think in retrospect, I didn't put this person in my top 10 worst players of all time. I kind of regret that at this point. And that person's David Girton from Big Brother 15. And David was just really a bad player. I mean, he had no clue what he was doing. He did have some allies, mind you, even some of those allies ended up turning on him by the end of the week, where again, he was aligned with the boats and hoes side of the house, having the showmance with Aaron, and through that was aligned with Gina Marie and Caitlin and Jeremy and Nick. But again, it is Jeremy and Nick that orchestrate the flip on him as the biggest physical threat outside of the moving company. And again, he just ends up being completely aloof the entire time, doesn't really do much actively in the game, but is also just targeted because he is such a blatant physical threat, which in ways you can compare this to the likes of Carol and an Ashlea as these people that really didn't do anything. But again, I feel like David at least had allies who legitimately did vote for him to stay. So again, I guess that's enough to put him this high at 17. Now number 16, and these next three for me are so similar. Like I think all three of these next people are people who played very similar style of games. People who were the leaders of the minority alliance and were targeted week one because of that. Also showed a lot of cockiness throughout their first week that led to their eventual downfall. And at 15, the worst of those, from a gameplay perspective at least, for me, ends up being Keith from Big Brother 13. And Keith, again, was a major instigator of the Regulators group. He thought he had all of the newbies wrapped around his finger to the point where he threw the veto in order to keep himself on the block, only to find out that he obviously doesn't have the numbers on his side and does eventually get booted. And some of that is through his own poor play. I mean, I don't think he treats Kalia particularly well to where she votes against him. He kind of just dismisses a lot of the vets, not even banking on their votes at all, despite the fact that he needed them by the end of it. And again, for me, I feel like he plays the worst of these three, who are all pretty notably bad first boots here. So because that for me, he's here number 16. Now number 15, someone that's super similar. To be honest, there's very little difference for me between Keith and this person. Really, the main difference for me was the fact that at least this person didn't throw the veto, and that person is Jozea from Big Brother 18. And again, a lot of people talk about Jozea as the worst first boot in the history of the show, and I don't agree with that, largely because, again, he was the leader of his side of the house. He at least had a solid backing with him. He had the likes of Paul and Victor on his side. He had the likes of Natalie, Bronte, and Bridget on his side. Now, at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. I think the fact that he was able to get this group together, and also had Glenn before Glenn got taken out of the game, Jozea was actually in a decent position numbers-wise. He really has the biggest backing out of any of the players in this tier here. The problem is just how cocky he was. Again, like Keith, he was extremely cocky. Mind you, again, he didn't throw the veto, veto, so at least there's that. But he still obviously openly talked to the vets about how he's the messiah for the newbies. He openly targeted Nicole when Nicole was the HOH, and really just thought he was running the show, to where, again, like, he did have a decent backing, but to him, he thought he had an even bigger backing. He thought he had pretty much everyone on his side, which is ridiculous considering how open he was in targeting the vets, yet he thought he had the likes of Davon and James on his side, which makes no sense. So again, like, it's like Josea's positives are the fact that he did have a pretty big alliance. Despite being the first boot, it's just that it's surrounded by a lot of poor play, but it is the fact that he had that alliance at all that leaves him out of the conversation of worst first boot for me. He's here number 15. Now number 14 is a player that I really just don't like. I mean, this is probably one of the most unlikable people on this list. I think this is a person that's kind of forgotten about as one of the least likable people on Big Brother, but he fits along in this tier with Jozea and Keith, and for me, at the end of the day, he probably is at the top of it, considering he's the closest to staying out of this entire group. And we do have Braden from Big Brother 11, and again, Braden is a very unlikable figure here. Again, he is a person who said a lot of icky things on the feeds, and despite that, had half the house backing him. I mean, he was essentially the leader of the Minority Alliance, having a really good relationship with Jeff and Jordan. He had Laura, he had Casey, he had Michelle, and before his eventual backdoor, he also had Lydia, which through that, he technically had the majority at one point. He had over half the house on his side, which again is more than you can say about any of the boots we've talked about so far. The problem is that obviously he ends up isolating Lydia through his bigoted behavior, and mind you, at that point, Lydia had already made a deal to vote him out, but it's still just terrible behavior there that really sealed his fate. So at that point, obviously, there was no way he was getting her vote. At that point, he was really banking on Ronnie, who he did think he had up until the eviction, but Ronnie obviously ends up flipping, leading to a tie where Jesse is the one to vote him out. Again, like, he comes close to staying despite his terrible behavior, and again, in comparison to people we've talked about, from a gameplay perspective, I guess that's something, but again, still a very unlikable presence, and one that I really didn't want to put too much higher here. Now number 13, moving on to a player that I have talked about on my worst players of all time list. And I'll be honest, I probably softened my opinion on this person since I made that video, and that person is Joey from Big Brother 16. Now, Joey is a player that is another pretty actively bad player. I mean, she does create this all-girls alliance, and once the rumors of this alliance spreads, she is the person that takes the brunt of the blame for it, to the point where she ends up getting backdoored week 1. However, I do think a couple pros come from this. One, the fact that she wasn't the initial target. The initial target was Donnie, and Donnie did win the veto, so that is an element of bad luck for her. Also, the fact that even once Donnie won the veto, she still wasn't the target. Caleb really had to be convinced to put Joey on the block through the information of her creating this all-girls alliance in order for this plan to eventually go through. So again, I think those are minor pros here for me that put her above the last group we talked about. But again, I feel like the fact that she never really had a backing in the game, no one really wanted to work with her long term. Everyone kind of just dropped her when she did end up on the block. And really all of her campaigning just made things worse, to where while she wasn't staying to begin with, her campaigning just made her look even more volatile of a player, to where no one wanted to keep her around. But at the end of the day, I did end up landing her here at number 13. Next up, moving on to number 12, we're moving on to a player that I did lump in with Joey. This person is Annie from Big Brother 12. And Annie is an interesting case here. I do think Annie is someone that kind of gets guilty by association. I mean, she is a player that seemed to have some game ability early on. She seemed to have a savvy strategic mind at first, and was obviously the saboteur as well, and was successful at the beginning. Though when Brennan and Rachel end up becoming the social pariahs of the house, she kind of becomes too close with them, and through that gets lumped in with them to the point where when Brendan ends up winning the veto, she ends up becoming the backdoor target as someone still connected with them. And also on her way out, she doesn't do herself any favors, really coming off as a really chaotic figure. here and really just further dooms herself after the fact. Again, for me, I do feel like the difference between Annie and Joey here ends up being, one, the fact that I feel like she did less wrong to become the target, where again, Joey had the fact that she created this all-girls alliance. Annie really was just like close to Brendan, so they wanted to weaken Brendan. Also the fact that she was the saboteur, and I think that was talked about as a possibility to where getting Annie out would get rid of the saboteur. So again, like I feel like there are other instances there that kind of separate the two, and because I did end up putting Annie here number 12. Now number 11, we're starting another tier here, a tier of players that were not the initial target and not even the target by the HOH, but still end up going home by the end of the week. And at number 11, we're starting off with the earliest first boot we'll be talking about, and that is Sheryl from Big Brother 2. And again, Sheryl is the prototypical story of the pawn that ends up going home. She was someone that was put on the block by Mike Boogie, thinking that there was no way that they would send Sheryl home, as a plan from Boogie to guarantee that Nicole ends up going home. But through Chilltown's really cocky behavior and isolating themselves from the house, the votes end up being flipped onto Sheryl, again, due to really nothing Sheryl did, though also at the same time, Sheryl was a bit passive in the game. Again, Nicole had to do some convincing to flip over votes in order to keep herself safe. So through that, she obviously gets outplayed in this instance. But again, there isn't that much wrong Sheryl does here outside of being a bit too passive. And again, she's really getting taken out due to the failures of other people. So again, there's not too much wrong I can say about Sheryl here, but there's also not too much positive either, to where she doesn't really do anything actively well across the season. So for me, I do have the lander here, kind of in the middle of the road here at number 11. At number 10, a very similar first boot. However, I do think there are more elements of this person getting unlucky than the previous one. And at number 10, we do have Jillian from Big Brother 19. Now, Jillian as a whole, I think is probably a pretty bad player, probably a worse player than this list indicates. However, as a first boot, she gets extremely unlucky to end up being the first boot here. I mean, really, throughout the entire week, she was always intended to be the pawn. She was always put on the block in a position where Cody never actually intended on her going home. She was on the block against Megan initially, where Megan was initially the target. Megan then quits the game, to which Alex is the replacement. Alex was then the target. Alex then won the veto, to which Cody won to target Paul. Paul was put on the block but had dependent protection, to where he gets taken off the block, and eventually Christmas ends up being on the block. The votes end up flipping off of Christmas onto Jillian just as a move against the HOH. And again, this is a lot of unlucky circumstances for Jillian here. Now, like Sheryl, do I think she does anything right? No, not really. I mean, she does have good relationships with Alex and Jason. That's something, I guess. But really, outside that, doesn't do anything well. But also, again, like, she just gets massively screwed over, and her eventually being the person that goes home, largely due to the failings of Cody, and also due to a lot of other unforeseen circumstances occurring, like Paul's pendant of protection, and like Megan end up quitting. So, for me, Jillian is just someone that it was way more unlucky than the likes of Sheryl, despite them being in similar positions, and because that, for me, Jillian ends up being above her here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to another player that has an element of bad luck, though despite that also ends up being kind of close to staying, and that person is Lori from Big Brother 3. Now, Lori is an interesting case here because Lori was initially put up as a pawn against Marcellus. Marcellus was the initial target. However, Jerry ends up winning the veto and decides to be on a moral high ground and wanting to save Marcellus due to his poor treatment, in a position where he also wants to save Lori as well. Lori was another one of his closest allies, but decides to save Marcellus because he was the initial target here. And when on a block against Amy, Lori actually comes extremely close to staying, despite again not being the initial target here. Though again, I ran through this in my Big Brother 3 retrospective, that it's like she comes close to staying, though a lot of these votes are very wonky, where I don't think many of these votes actually wanted her to stay. I think it was more so they made these very minor promises that they didn't want to go back on, particularly the likes of Josh and Danielle, who swore to her they would keep her, so they do end up voting for her to stay. Though despite that, she did legitimately have the votes of someone like a Jason and a Jerry. But also, I do think you have the falter for not getting the vote of Roddy, someone she was extremely close to in the game, but Roddy decides to cut her loose as a loose cannon, so I think that is something to knock her for here. But still, I do feel like she ends up being unlucky, being put on the block as a pawn. and ends up going home due to the veto being used in a situation where they didn't know about the veto coming into the season. So because of these instances of her being kind of screwed over and also her being kind of close to staying, I did put her above the last few people we talked about here at number 9. Now number 8, we're moving on to another first boot that I do think was screwed over to a degree. I mean, this is a person that was like the 5th target on the board, but ends up being the one that is on the block by the time of the eviction. So again, a kind of similar case to Jillian, but also I think has this massive stigma against him, and that person ends up being Travis from Big Brother 23. Now, the reason I have Travis above the likes of Jillian is because I do think something to add into this is also this preconceived notion of him being this physical threat that factors into it as well. Where again, I feel like that's something that he just came in with this big target on his back, especially from the likes of Frenchie, who initially talked about wanting to get rid of a straight white guy. And Travis was one of the few straight white guys on the cast. But again, even despite that, Travis was really one of the last targets for Frenchie here. Frenchie started off wanting to target Brent. However, Brent did do some good work in convincing Frenchie to not target him. Then you had Christian end up winning safety through the wildcard competition. That gives him immunity. Then the target shifted to Alyssa as someone that was associated with Christian. But then eventually the target flipped over to Kylan as someone that was kind of going against Frenchie's plans. And then Derek X ends up winning the veto, and due to a promise he made, ends up using the veto on Kylan. To where at that point, Frenchie's left with pretty much only Travis left to nominate, especially after his promises to not target a woman or a person of color, even though he already did those things. But again, like, it's a lot of things that had to happen to cause Travis to end up being on the block by the end of it. And with this pre-established notion of him needing to be a target because he is this physical threat, I do feel like for me, it does lead to him being this high on the list. As while again, he does have the issue of being too passive in the game, I think outside of that, there isn't that much wrong he really does here, and just gets unlucky with all the circumstances happening around him. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 8. Now number 7, moving on to another first boot similar to Travis that wasn't the initial target off the bat, so has a lot of unlucky circumstances surrounding him, and that is Ovi from Big Brother 21. And Ovi is a player that did seem to struggle socially while there. I mean, he just seemed to be a social outcast where he never really was that well integrated within the social dynamics. While he did try to build relationships with the likes of Jack and Jackson and had relationships with Cliff and Nicole, he still ends up being a consensus target by the end of it. However, again, he is a person that wasn't the initial target on the board. I mean, he was initially looked at as a person that was on the outskirts of that majority alliance, to where they wanted to keep him around, where the initial plan was to backdoor Kemi, though that plan ends up not following through, and largely just because Sam had already promised Cliff that he was going to use the veto on him, and through that didn't want to leave the noms the same, so they were like, okay, I guess we have the backdoor Ovi then. Also, the factor in the fact that he did have low activity power that he won, that he couldn't use at that point, which is really disappointing. But the fact that he did end up winning it also further puts a target on his back, as they want to get rid of him before he has the chance of using it. And again, I feel like these are unlucky circumstances. Again, did he play this round well? No. I mean, obviously not. But I do feel like he was a more active player in the game than someone like a Travis, while also still having the same downsides of not being the initial target and also not being able to use his activity. So again, for me, it's enough to land him here at number 7. Now number 6, and now I think we're in the top tier of first boots. I think these are all pretty good first boots at this point, whether that means that they were screwed over, or they had a lot of agency at one point, or almost didn't go home. It's like, these are a grouping of the better first boots in Big Brother US history. And at number 6, we're starting it off with the first returning player on the board. We're starting it off with Alison from Big Brother 7. Now, Alison is an interesting case here because obviously there is the pregame stigma that she had on her, the fact that she was this very manipulative and cutthroat player, and coming into an all-star season, obviously that was always going to be a target on her back. And to be honest, that is what keeps her in this top tier for me, as really I feel like outside that, she doesn't really play her boot week that well on Big Brother 7. With her openly targeting Janelle, someone who is obviously the HOH here, and getting caught with Danielle and trying to convince Jace to not agree to the nomination combinations to put himself and Janelle on the block, which was not really necessary at that point, considering Alison didn't really seem to be in the firing line at that point. So it's not even like she plays well on All-Stars. I do think she plays actively poorly, but again, when we add in the stigma that she already had against her already, and the fact that she initially was in the majority to a degree of these players that were anti the BB6 alliance, though, considering again that they were in power, the fact that she's still targeting them is pretty asinine. So again, it really is a pretty bad game, but one that is perpetuated by pregame notions that leaves her in this top tier, though at the very bottom of it here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to a very notable first boot here. I think the pretty typical person that's noted as one of the better first boots on the board. And I did consider putting this one higher, and that is from BB10, we have Brian Hart, and I very much considered putting him higher than number 5 here. The problem for me is the fact that really a lot of his boot is his own doing. I mean, we'll talk about the top 4, but the top 4 are all people who were essentially screwed over to some degree. Brian Hart is a player that really just does it all to himself. Mind you, I do think the highs of Brian Hart's game are higher than any other first boot in the history of Big Brother US. I mean, he had a pretty good stranglehold on the game for the first half of the first week. He was controlling Jerry's HOH and got exactly what he wanted. The problem is that he got a bit cocky. He did end up really just showboating to the other players the amount of control that he had, and when Ollie gets called out for being a part of that group, he ends up obviously leaking all that information to the Coven, who then gather the majority of the house to end up flipping the entire game onto Brian. But at the same time, it is very impressive that it took literally the entire house going to the HOH room to get Jerry to change his mind and backdoor Brian here. And again, when we're talking about a first boot ranking, again, outside of being screwed over, I do think Brian Hart probably played the best possible game you can play for a first boot, having a lot of control in the game, and even by the time he leaves, still had allies and people that wanted him to stay. It's just that they didn't have the numbers. So again, Brian Hart is a very strong first boot. However, again, like, he largely does it to himself in a situation where, again, the top 4 here for me are all people that were screwed over by either twists or bizarre circumstances. And because of that, for me, Brian ends up landing here at number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to the other returning player on the list here. We're going to Big Brother All-Stars 2. You have Keesha Smith. And for me, I feel like Keesha is a player that does end up getting harmed here by her pregame reputation, but kind of in the opposite way of Alison, where again, Alison is harmed by the fact that she's looked at as this manipulative and cutthroat player, while Keesha is harmed by the fact that she's not remembered at all by this point, to where most people didn't even know who she was on this season. And also, a major factor of that is the fact that she wasn't able to participate in any of the pregame for this season because she was an alternate on this season, which again also adds to the fact that almost nobody knew who she was. So that alone is already something that did harm her, but also when we add in the fact that she was also not the initial target, where initially Cody did want to target Kaser. However, Kaser ends up winning the safety suite and also ends up saving Janelle along the way, which through that kind of just leaves Keesha as the other remaining target there, which again is an element of bad luck there for Keesha. That did leave her as a pretty easy consensus first boot here, due to the fact that, again, she had no connections coming this season outside of Memphis, who didn't have the greatest relationship with. And Cody in particular had no clue who she was. Now, I will say that I do think Keesha played extremely passively across this week, to where she didn't really even try to stay until the very end, and by that point it was just too late. But again, I don't know how much there really was for her to really do here that could have saved her. So again, like, I think it's kind of a mediocre game here, but one that is largely affected by her reputation in the pregame and the fact that she wasn't able to pregame. So because of that, for me, she's here at number 4. Now, number 3, moving on to a player that initially was actually in the tier with like the Sheryls and Jillians and Loris of the world, these people who weren't the targets but get taken out as a move against the HOH. However, I think when you really look into it even more, there's a lot of other reasons why this person ends up being the first boot that were completely out of their control. We do have Kara from Big Brother 14. And Kara is someone that, again, I just think it's very unlucky. Not just in the fact that she's on the block against Frank in a position where Willie Hance had created such a massive target on his back to where Janelle and Boogie team up to flip the game on Willie by voting out Kara and keeping Frank in the game as a weapon to target Willie moving forward. But also, you have to factor in that Kara was only even on the block to begin with because she was on a coach's season to where her coach was Dan Giesling. Where again, I think the coaches had such a major impact early on in the game here where Janelle and Brittany were initially working together while Mike and Dan were working together. And when Brittany's player got HOH, that obviously meant that she was going to target people from the other side, and through that just nominates the perceived stronger players from Boogie and Dan's sides, with Kara being perceived as a stronger player from Dan's side. And even when taking out Kara, they're looking at it also as a move to weaken Dan, who is someone that came into this season with such a massive reputation and a target on his back. So again, like, it's a lot of very unlucky circumstances for Kara being on Team Dan that I do think, mixing that in, the fact that also Willie becomes such a social pariah, and also the fact that she's on the block against Frank, someone that is very openly anti-Willie, that does cause Kara to end up going home here in a position where, again, like, I don't think she does that much wrong. Especially when, like, the people that are voting for her to leave are the likes of a Will and Ashley, people who had connections with Kara and really only vote her out because of their connection to Janelle and being on Janelle's team. And again, I just feel like Kara gets massively screwed over across the season. So again, for me, Kara just gets extremely unlucky throughout this season, and because of that, she ends up landing here at number 3. Now, number 2, we're moving on to a player that it kind of baffles me when I hear many people talk about this person in a pretty negative light, as, again, I've always looked at this person as one of the best first boots out there, and that person is Steve from Big Brother 20. And straight up, I mean, like, again, you're going to see the number 1 pick, but I think with most people, based on how they look at first boots, Steve would technically be my number 1 first boot on the board due to the weird circumstances around the number 1 person on this list. But Steve is a player that really shouldn't have been the first boot. And he is the person that had the majority of the house backing him. The entire Falte side of the house was backing Steve, and through that was just straight up the majority. While Tyler, the HOH, was part of level 6 and they were targeting Steve as just this easy target to get rid of, they actually didn't have the numbers to do so. And considering the massive disadvantage that someone like Steve has coming into any given Big Brother season, the fact that they were ineffective in getting the votes on him to begin with is a pretty big pro for Steve here. To where the reason why Steve ends up going home here are due to some very bizarre circumstances, and really it's something that I don't think a normal player would do, and it probably is what ends up being Tyler's best move across the entire season, to where he's able to manipulate Caitlyn into flipping her vote on Steve, this person who she looked at as a father figure, someone she was extremely close to, and Tyler does a very effective job in convincing her to flip against Steve by lying to Caitlyn about Sam's power app and saying that it would protect her if she was voted out, which, I mean, again, it just makes no sense really for Caitlyn to believe this. And even if she did believe it, like, why not just let Sam burn her power app? But again, the fact that Tyler was so effective in manipulating Caitlyn here is what does end up leading to Steve's eviction, which again is something that would rarely happen. It was such a bizarre sequence of events here that Caitlyn wasn't even voting out Steve because she wanted to vote out Steve. It's just that the way that she interpreted all this information was that she thought that by voting out Steve, she was protecting the core of her alliance, when in reality she was just tricked into doing so. But really, Steve did have the backing of most of the players in the house, and again, was pretty much put up here just because he sucked at the initial HOH comp, and again, was looked at as an easy target, despite the fact that he wasn't an easy target. So again, I personally think Steve played pretty well across this first week, and really just gets unlucky that he's facing off against Tyler, who ends up being one of the best players of all time, and pulls off a really impressive move in manipulating Caitlyn that leads to him being the first boot here. But again, I think in most situations, he would have been able to get through this. And because of all those wonky situations, I do have Steve here at number 2. Now, number 1. The number 1 first boot is, again, a very strange one, because this is one that, again, I don't think most people would consider a first boot, but due to all my rules about who is considered a first boot and who isn't, the first boot, the number 1 person on my first boot ranking ends up being Parker from Big Brother 9. And again, I think there are people that will argue that Jacob should be the first boot. And again, I can understand that. However, I think to keep consistency here, I did decide to go with Jen and Parker as the first boots here instead of Jacob, considering the fact that I didn't want to include the likes of a Jody and a Glenn and these people who really didn't have the opportunity to play the game. And to keep the consistency with that, I feel like I couldn't include Jacob, considering he wasn't formally evicted in a normal round of Big Brother. Though, if Jacob was included here, he would have been at the very bottom. So instead, I had to include Parker, who ends up being one of the most screwed over players in the history of Big Brother, and because that, he's number 1 on the first boot ranking. Again, he was booted because he was paired up with Jen. Again, Jen, who was the most reviled person on this season, someone that went on a massive power trip and had most of the house hating her, while also her obviously having the connection to Ryan, which further put a target on her back, while also then doing some really terrible campaigning in order trying to stay, which even further sinks them. And again, this is all while Parker is actually in a decent spot outside of Jen. Like, he has good relationships with the likes of Matt and Alex, and had a good relationship with Amanda, but was mostly just taken out because they needed to take out Jen. And Parker really just ends up being a massively screwed over player here, largely due to the dumb twist of BB9 of playing the game in pairs and being evicted in pairs. And if it was not for that, Parker would definitely make it further into the game. Now, I will say that overall, in terms of game ability, I do think Parker demonstrates some red flags along the way. I do think he got a bit confrontational at points. Obviously, his relationship with Alex got a bit strained due to him getting too close to Amanda as well. So it's not like Parker is perfect either, though Parker 100% would not have been in danger to begin with had it not been for the fact that he was paired up with Jen, who was obviously a terrible player, but even beyond that, once again, had the Ryan situation play a factor as well. So because of all those things, for me, Parker is the best first boot if you want to quantify him as one in the history of Big Brother US. But there we go. I mean, that's my Big Brother first boot ranking. Again, a bit of a train wrecky list here. And I will say it is very difficult to rank these earlier boots in Big Brother, largely because there's very few good ones, with really most of these players having massive holes in their games. But again, I guess that's just the nature of Big Brother for you. But with that, I do still plan on doing a couple more first boot rankings. Australian Survivor, Survivor South Africa. I'm not going to do a BB Can one, at least not now, because the massive ranking of every player from BB Can, that kind of makes that video irrelevant. But I have a few other bigger Big Brother rankings I want to do before BB25, things like a cast ranking, pre-jury, post-jury ranking, stuff like that. So stay tuned for those down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.